Our next guest is the kind of guy people either love or hate. Clinical psychologist Jordan B. Peterson has been described as one of the most influential thinkers of our time, but also as an alt-right figurehead who spouts conspiracies. Despite what you think about him, there is no denying the professor's impact, his videos amassing more than 45 million views on YouTube.
It's an honour to have you, Professor.
A darling of cable conservatives.
And that's a much bigger risk. So
Yes, it is.
With an almost religious following online, clinical psychologist Jordan B. Peterson has become something of a rock star in the crusade against political correctness.
Free speech is the mechanism by which we keep our society functioning.
The Canadian professor rising to fame in 2016 for opposing changes to the country's anti-discrimination laws.
I think this legislation is reprehensible.
Changes that effectively made it illegal not to call a trans person by their preferred gender pronoun, like ze or they.
I'd like to encourage people struggling with this to be kind as their first impulse.
kindness is the excuse that social justice warriors use when they want to exercise control over what other people think and say.
His lectures leading to controversy on campus at the University of Toronto.
Peterson, do you have any comments on the Nazi presence at your protest?
Yeah, I don't like Nazis.
This interview on British television clocked up more than 8 million views.
Why should your right to freedom of speech trump a trans person's right not to be offended?
Because in order to be able to think, you have to risk being offensive. I mean, look at the conversation we're having right now.
Dr. Peterson has been in Australia promoting his self-help book, 12 Rules for Life, at sold-out lectures around the nation. And Professor Jordan Peterson joins us now from Brisbane. Good morning to you. Thanks for being with us. As we just said, you've written a book called 12 Rules for Life. It's almost like your own 10 commandments. Now, if people were only going to read one of them, which would you say is the most important?
It's probably the rule that involves telling the truth. Tell the truth, or at least don't lie, is the most important one, I would say.
And why is that so important?
Well, because if you don't speak the truth, and if you speak things that you know to be false, then you mess up the structures of your own consciousness, and you can't hope to function effectively in the world. You have perceptual mechanisms that orient you in the world and that lay out what you see and how you act and how you react. And if you pathologize those by lying, then you disorient yourself in the world, and then terrible things will happen to you and the people around you. So at very least, you should try not to say things you know not to be false.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like anything that we want to happen. You've been called by some as one of the most influential thinkers of our time. One of your messages is about cleaning up your room. How much is that part of your overall message?
Well, it's a metaphor in some sense. It's like our young people are taught constantly to, especially in universities, to go out and try to change the world. And you know, you don't know that much when you're young, but there's lots of things that you have right in front of you that are in disarray and disorder within your own life, within your own family. And you can start by practicing on things that are right within your grasp. And so this clean up your room idea has become very popular online because I make a very strong case for it, and because it's comically humble, I suppose.
A lot of pressure on you. We'd like to see your room. Is it always tidy?
No, I wouldn't say so. In the last 18 months, it's got rather messy because things have got beyond me to some degree, but I do make every effort I can to keep it orderly. So.
Okay. Now, you say that one reason for the gender pay gap is the fact that women are agreeable. Do you think that women should be less agreeable?
Well, they should be less agreeable if they want to be paid more when they're in a competitive enterprise. I mean, agreeableness has it's a big 5 personality trait. It has its utility. Agreeableness is extremely useful when you're dealing with very young children or with people who need care. That's the primary personality dimension, regulating compassion, for example. But in a competitive enterprise, then agreeableness sets you at a disadvantage, and you need to learn to be more assertive, how to stand up for yourself instead of other people, let's say.
Well, that comes also to another point in your book where you say stand up straight, and that is also about being combative. Does us walking out into the world with a sort of aim to be more combative, does that make us more aggressive as a society?
No, I wouldn't say it's about being more combative. It's about being more courageous. That's not the same thing. To stand up straight with your shoulders back is to actually expose the most vulnerable parts of yourself to the world. And that's a courageous act. It indicates confidence and the willingness to take risk. That's not the same as combativeness or aggression. It's competence and courage. And those are very different things.
Now, you rose to prominence for your opposition to laws in Canada compelling people to use gender-neutral pronouns like ze or they rather than he or she. The Commonwealth Games begin here in Australia next month, and volunteers are being told not to use phrases like ladies and gentlemen or policemen to be more inclusive. What's wrong with being more inclusive?
Well, I suppose there's nothing wrong with being more inclusive, but there's plenty wrong with adopting the radical left's guidelines for linguistic conduct. And that's what I was opposing in Canada. It's these regulations policing language are part and parcel of a much broader agenda that's being pushed unbelievably hard. It's already subsumed the universities. So I don't buy the we're doing this because we're compassionate explanation in the least. I believe it's a power play on the part of the radical Marxists who've already infiltrated the universities. And so that's partly why I objected to the legal requirements being put forward in Canada.
Let's be really clear on this, because this has really been the issue that has put you in the spotlight. You are saying that if there was a trans person in one of your lectures, you would refer to them as they wanted to. It's the legislation that you don't like.
Yeah, it's the fact that the government is compelling speech. And, you know, we already have hate speech laws in Canada, and I think that was a big mistake to begin with, because God only knows who's going to define hate, but it won't be the people that you want to have define it. But to then step forward one more step and to actually regulate the content of speech, to say what people have to say, the government has crossed a line that no government should ever cross, no matter what the reason. What
do you say to people who perhaps might not be as respectful as you, and you're saying that you would call a trans person by however they wanted to be referred to? What do you say to other people who might not be respectful like that and do need the legislation to keep them in line?
They don't need that legislation. No one needs that legislation. It's terrible legislation. It's the first time in the history of English common law in Canada that the government has dared to introduce compelled speech as a requirement in our country. There's no excuse for it whatsoever. And the fact that they're using the trans population as the excuse to move this legislation forward is reprehensible as far as I'm concerned.
Okay. Even if somebody finds that really damaging to them?
Well, if they find the misuse of a pronoun damaging to them, then they have more problems than that are going to be solved by the mere reconstruction of someone else's language. Besides, it doesn't matter what the excuse is. The government has no right to compel speech. This is the thing, is that the rationale is compassion, but the impulse is totalitarian. I don't care what the rationale is. I don't care how compassionate the rationale is. The government doesn't get to regulate the content, well, of my speech anyways, because I wouldn't comply with the regulations, with the law. Not under any circumstances whatsoever. And I feel that it's the moral duty of citizens to stand up against that sort of compelled speech legislation. There's no excuse for it whatsoever.
Okay, you have really struck a nerve with people with the things that you are saying. You say that there is an epidemic of depression and aimlessness, and we don't make the case for growing up well. What is the right case?
Well, most people find the meaning in... You need a meaning in your life to offset the suffering in your life. You need a profound meaning. And most people find that meaning through the adoption of difficult responsibility, like career goals, educational goals, family, the support of a family, the establishment of a permanent relationship. We need to see those things as not only moral obligations, but as part and parcel of what it is, what gives people the courage to step forward in life. And so I'd be making a strong case for responsibility and truth as an antidote to terror and uncertainty. And it's not a finger-wagging case either. I'm not saying, look, young people, get your act together because, you know, there's something wrong with you. I'm saying there's way more to you than you know, and that if you step forward properly, you can fill a hole in the world that's exactly your shape. That'll be good for you and for everyone else. It's a very positive idea. And people are responding to it as if it's a very positive idea.
All right, we're out of time. Jordan Peterson, thank you so much for being with us. We appreciate it.
Thanks very much for the interview.
Fundamentally moral, and moral, as far as I'm concerned, has to do with action, right? Because moral decisions are the decisions that you make when you're structuring action. When you decide to do one thing or another, generally you want to do things that are the best things that you can think of to do, and hence good. But sometimes you also want to do things that are the worst things you can do, you know, because you're angry or resentful or bitter. And so the moral decisions that you make that govern your actions are really the most important decisions that you make in your life. And it's not that easy to figure out how to make moral decisions. We don't have an unerring technology for that the same way as we do for, say, making decisions about empirical reality, which in some ways seem a lot simpler.